Well, my name's Richard Kimber, but everyone calls me Dick up here.
Yeah.
Dick the Scrubbers, a good friend, calls me that, but I'm mainly known as a bloke who has a yarn outside the post office. That'd be my main attribute, I think, but I've been long interested in history and Aboriginal culture and archaeology, ornithology, all sorts of issues. I think most things are interesting, but I'm mainly known as an historian or writer-historian up here.
And would you like to tell people how you came to know Xavier Herbert?
Initially it was through reading, because I used to read greatly, and I read Disturbing Element and Capricornia. I think Capricornia is probably the first one I read. Found it a very good novel of the era. I would have read it long after it was first published, I think. But and then I read, he had his short stories and things like that. I can't think one about, he indicated about his time as a chemist in one of them was sort of, I found the best of them very good. Some of it I didn't appeal to me, but that's the same as any writer. And then he came to Alice Springs. I didn't know he was in the Alice, but he arrived at the door. There's a knock on the door, and I opened the door, and I straight away recognised him. There must have been something in the paper that had an image of him, and I said, "Oh, hello, no," I said, "Xavier Herbert," that's what I said. And he sort of went a bit like that, and he said, "Did you know I was coming?" And I said, no, I just recognised you." And I think he was a bit surprised at that. He said, "But I must experience a full year in the Central Australia to understand it." And he knew it was going to be very cold. He knew that that's why he'd lived in north of the tropic nearly all his life, was, if not almost all his life, I think, Perth and other places when he was younger, but whatever the case, he wanted to get back to experience what it was like to live here, because he said you can't write about a place unless you've actually experienced it to some extent. So that's why he went out to Ross River, which allowed him to get out of the town area. And when he was out there, he had a caravan, he had a little trailer he had, which when I first saw it, it had the solar panels on it. The very first time I ever saw solar panels on a little trailer. They're quite common now. That was 1982 or whatever time it was, about then, and he was very proud of having that. The trailer also had a big long hollow plastic pipes on it, a bit like you use for surveyors have them for them maps or rods and stuff like that. So he had those for water on there, I believe, if I remember rightly. So he wanted to be very self-contained, very proud of how he'd set the little trailer up. And when the caravan was set up, he was quite proud he had an awning on it. And he said, "This is the setting for the novel." I'll give the novel's name in a little while, but this was going to be a new novel, and there's a very nice pointed bit of the range out at Ross River. It's very, in certain lights it's dark chocolate, and other lights it's almost a vermilion red sort of a thing. It's different lights that change like all the ranges. You get lovely lights at different times of the day and different times of the year. It's slightly different. But he said the moon comes up, and the moon sits right on the point of that range there. And I was actually out there camped at a footy camp one time, and I paid attention. The moon was right over the point there, and he loved that sort of dazzling brilliance of stars you get in that clarity of sky you have here. That's much greater clarity than anywhere in the tropics or near the coast. It's that inland clarity.
I'm David Moncrieff. I was an ABC journalist in Alice Springs between 1982 and about 1996, and I was working in the old Alice Springs offices of the ABC one day in 1983 when a guy came to the counter and said, "Hi, I'm Xavier Herbert. I'm here to see a colleague of mine who was in the office at the time." That would have been about March '83, I'd reckon, and Xavier, and I said, "Oh, Xavier Herbert." I sort of had read Capricornia and knew of and had tried to read Poor Fellow My Country. Tried twice now, 3 times now. I haven't ever quite made it to the end of the book, unfortunately. But I was a great admirer of the writing. The descriptive writing is fantastic, and the characterisations of the people in Capricornia, for example, and in Poor Fellow My Country, are just some really good writing. I think it's it's an interesting and it's a really graphic, colourful saga. I think of outback Australia in particular. So. And we got chatting about what his plans were at that stage of the game. I think he was on a reconnaissance of Alice Springs because he wanted to come to Alice Springs, and I think as he used to put it, to write a third big novel or die in the attempt. And of course, unfortunately, he came to Alice Springs the following year, and I guess you could say he died in the attempt. I don't know how far he got. I don't remember how far he got with the third big novel, but certainly I think he had a good idea of how he wanted to develop it, and of course it was going to be called Billy Goat Hill, and I think that was an allegorical novel built around the Billy Goat Hill, which of course is quite a central feature in the central area of Alice Springs. I said, well, when you come back to town, for good. I mean, this was the aim. Was he was going to basically pack up and leave Red Lynch and come to the centre and see out his days in the centre and write the third great novel. Come look me up. So I thought no more about it after that. He went off and did his thing, packed up, and anyway, Julie arrived in early 1984, and yes, he got in touch, came into the ABC one day. We were up 2 flights of stairs, 2 stories, and he used to find that a bit of a trial climbing up because of course he'd had knee operations, and he found the stairs a bit of a bind. I think he was a pretty fit old guy for a bloke in his 80s, but I think the knees gave him a bit of Larry Dooley, particularly climbing. So, and when he came back to Alice Springs, he came with all his gear. He had his Land Rover, a little aluminium trailer with solar panels on it. It was quite interesting for a guy who of that era. I think he was quite technologically turned on. So he had the solar panels. He had an inverter so that he could power a microwave of all things, a microwave oven which was sort of rigged up in the back of the Land Rover, and he had it kitted up so that he could actually sleep in the Land Rover or sleep out under the stars, and basically that was his. He was going to live like that, for the rest of the days. But anyway, it was a cold winter, 1984, and he used to come into town quite regularly, and always pop in and visit, in the office, and on his town trips and catch up, and I'd make a phone call or two, and then he. And we'd obviously chat, and we'd sort of build up a friendship, I suppose. Come around to my place for a meal occasionally, and then he'd generally shoot off back out to Ross River, where he was living, I think, sort of loosely in the vicinity of the Ross River homestead, and I think he had he also developed a friendship with Andy Green, who was one of the sons of the Green family who had the homestead at that stage of the game, and his wife was a teacher, and so he used to see quite a bit of them. But I think 1984 winter was quite severe. I think he found it fairly hard with his arthritis, and he decided to order a pop-up caravan. So he hunted around and got one made somewhere in Adelaide, and came up on the train, and he was really looking forward to that. And he took that out to Ross River then and lived in that. Had to get it a bit, a few things done to it, unfortunately, because I think that the pop-up mechanism was probably not as robust as he would have liked, and I think he was a bit annoyed by that, because I think he was a bit peeved that it had been sort of ripped off. He'd been ripped off a little bit. Anyway, he took that out, and he lived out there for the rest of the winter. That probably was about mid-winter or late winter when he got that, and then anyway he had issues with his carpal tunnel syndrome. So he packed up the caravan, brought it into town, and at that stage of the game he was spending overnight sort of stays in town with Arlene and Hans. Arlene was a librarian in the town library, and her husband was a carpenter in town. They lived in the Breitling area. So he used to, they didn't have children, so they had plenty of space in their house. So he used to, I think, have the run of the top floor pretty much, and they were happy for him to park his gear there and use that as a residential base while he was in town. So he parked his van there and went into hospital to have his carpal tunnel syndrome operated on by Charles Butcher. And anyway, on the day I had a bit of time, I took him to hospital, and he signed in and he said, got to have a next of kin. I said, well, what about Robin? And he said, well, she's in Cairns or Redlinch. So he said, what about you? And so I said, I'd be honoured. Well, which is true. I mean, it was a pretty low key sort of friendship, and he, as I say, it was a friendship that had developed over a period of some months, and we're just, it was just a conversational, as much as anything else, a conversational thing, and he sort of had a fair deal of respect for my space. I didn't, and I sort of respected his space, and it was sort of, so it was one of those sorts of, I suppose just an easygoing sort of a thing. And we used to chat about a whole range of things, and shared a lot of beliefs. He was really interested in Indigenous issues, I suppose, and the dispossession of Indigenous Australians, and we used to talk a lot about those sorts of issues. And he told me about his friendships with the McGuinness family and the Finnis River people, or the Paperback people, and a lot of that sort of background. I picked up that he'd had contact with Indigenous people from way back when he was a child growing up, and I think he was the son of a train driver, and so they used to move around WA quite a bit, and so it was, as I say, just an interesting friendship. I didn't sort of explore or probe too hard, but it was, as I say, we used to talk about a whole host of things, and I used to talked about meeting Sadie on the ship going to the UK, and writing of Capricornia, and he used to say, well, I was a Catholic, she was a Jew. As a Jewess, she had an eye for the money game, so she used to look after that, and I said, what about children? He said, she looked after that too. She made sure that wasn't going to interfere, and whatever, I think, or whatever that might have meant, and so she actually stayed out of the way and facilitated his writing because I guess obviously, like a lot of people, she appreciated the writing talent. It's interesting, since over the years, since I've discussed it on occasions, the friendship that I had with Xavier, and it's interesting that a lot of male writers, people will attribute the success, but more than the success, sometimes authorship of novels, to the female partner. It's the case with Hardy. A lot of people say that Thomas Hardy's wife wrote some of his best stuff. Dick Francis, there's a suggestion that Dick Francis, prolific crime writer, his work was done by, best work was done by his wife. And so I don't know who made the suggestion that perhaps that Sadie had a big say in some of the books that Xavier wrote. But I mean, having read them, I sort of tend to discount that because I think, in fact, I don't think she had the experience, for example, of Darwin, in the post-war times or the war times, and the Burdham Railway, for example. I mean, I asked him about Capricornia and whether it was based on the North Australian Railway, and I mean, there are sort of various stories about this. Some people will say that he said yes, it was based on the line, but I think my recollection of our conversation was that he actually denied the connection. That he wasn't he said, well, it's a railway line somewhere in outback Australia, basically. But I mean, it tends to the locale and understanding the life and times of the operation of that Northern Australian Railway. I'd have to say that it was probably fairly strongly had a strong basis on the North Australian line. So so it was. So we used to talk about all those sorts of things. I mean, I think he appreciated it. He met a hack that had actually read his book, and but had struggled with poor fellow McCountry, unfortunately. One of the things that he was very proud of was that poor fellow McCountry was bigger than the Bible, longer than the Bible, and I think that the aim was that Billy Goat Hill might also be quite an epic. I mean, poor fellow McCountry has got to be an epic. And I mean, even Capricornia was an epic. I saw Capricornia produced, Louis Nowra, I think, adapted it for the stage. And when Ted Egan opened his house, Sinkatini Downs, south of Alice Springs, there was a week-long festival, and it included the adaptation or the performance of Capricornia out in the green at Sinkatini Downs, including some great performances by a well-known actor who's now dead, unfortunately. One of my favourite Aboriginal women actors, in fact, and that was rather good to see that come to life. Of course, we used to occasionally have him around to our place for dinner. My eldest daughter was quite taken by Xavier, as was the person who used to type my news scripts at the ABC. I mean, we're all sort of very fond of him. And, we used to, as I say, chat about a whole range of things. He used to say that, and I sort of vividly remember it one day walking down Parsons Street to get a bottle of wine to take home. He said, we've dispossessed Indigenous Australia. We came here as thieves, and until we do something about the dispossession of Aboriginal Australia, we'll remain a nation of thieves. And he had a go at Bob Hawke about it one day on air. Bob Hawke visited Darwin just after he became Prime Minister, and they had him on a talkback show coming from Darwin, and Xavier hopped in and said, great to, he'd known Bob, met Bob years ago, and had a great regard for it, and I think he sort of really said, come on, Bob, we're going to have to do something about Indigenous Australians, from my memory. And Bob said, well, we'll do what I said, you won't always agree with what we're going to do, but we'll certainly give it a good go. But so I recall some of those sorts of things. And what else?
David, can I ask you a question? Was he interested in you as an individual?
Well, I think he was. We talked about where what I'd done, and where. I mean, he was. I think he's always interested in people, and he would sort of form opinions about people, and he would have strong opinions about people. I know that he had. At that stage of the game, he was sort of going through a little bit of a disconnect with Sydney Nolan, and he certainly was very scathing of Patrick White. I think probably there was a little bit of professional jealousy. And when I was interviewed some time ago, back in the 80s, about it, the interviewer then asked me if it was homophobia, and because of course Patrick White being who Patrick White was, I've never been quite sure about that. Possibly he was, perhaps anti-gay, but I don't know. It was just he, but yes, he was, and I think he was interested in all sorts of people. But he would make his judgments, obviously, as everybody does, against his background. I mean, we had other things in common as well. I mean, I flew aeroplanes, he had flown aeroplanes. I was interested in the sea, he'd done some work as a seaman and that sort of stuff. So, I mean, it's a funny place to end up as a person if you're interested in the ocean. But Alice Springs there's not, you can't get much further away from the sea at any time. So, yeah, we used to talk about that. We used to talk about, I used to smoke cigarettes at that time. He used to tell me about stopping smoking. And of course I stopped eventually years later. But he talked about visiting Alice Springs during his army career. He also used to talk about the work that he did as, I think it was protector of Aborigines in the top end, and the work with the at the compound in Darwin, and and I mean, he did have a strong relationship with particularly the McGuinness family, and I think that sort of had grown up through his role with the North Australia Workers Union, or the North Australia Workers Union, I think it was. And the dock stuff, and I know that he's written.
What's the dock
stuff?
stuff?
There was some. I think there was some dock.
Joe McGuinness.
The Joe McGuinness stuff, and so I think that so I think he was an advocate for for certainly the rights of the oppressed, and I think he considered that particularly Indigenous Australians were oppressed. I mean, there's little doubt about that at all. But and he was quite a strong advocate for certainly for land rights, and what would now be called native title rights. I don't think native title was really as much of an issue in one sense in terms of its currencies at the time, in the early 80s, because we were more interested, or people were more interested in land rights at that stage. But he was certainly a very strong and powerful advocate for redressing or addressing the dispossession of Indigenous Australians.
David, how did you come to be in Alice Springs?
I came to Alice Springs because I wanted to get into electronic media as a journalist. I'd done a cadetship and worked as a journalist at the Advertiser in the days when the Advertiser in Adelaide was a broadsheet, and before Murdoch got his grubby hands onto it, and I was interested in serious journalism, and I sort of felt that the best way to do that was to go to the ABC, and the ABC had a couple of jobs going, one in Adelaide and one in Alice Springs, and I thought Alice Springs would be fine. 16,000 people couldn't be all that bad. You know, it was attractive to 16,000 people. Couldn't be all that bad. A long way from home, but you know, if it wasn't that good, I could sort of stay a couple of years and then sort of say, well, I've done my time. I want to go back to Adelaide.
So it was a career move.
It was a career move. It was sort of moving to another exciting form of media, radio particularly. I also did television. I didn't particularly enjoy doing television, you know, because there's so many other things. Probably didn't do television all that well either. But that's a professional thing. Just excuse me.
Yeah, sure. What do you do now? You're a speechwriter?
Speechwriter. Yeah, I'm a speechwriter for a Commonwealth department.
Right.
And so I put the words into other people's mouths yet again, or still. So yeah, media releases, speeches, media inquiries, etc.
Right.
So it's sort of it's on the outer edge of spin, I suppose.
Well,
anyway, yeah. So yeah, I went to Alice Springs and I really enjoyed it. And at the end of 3 years, after Xavier died, I felt, well, you know, there's nothing to keep me. Not a lot. I mean, I thought I would return my grandchildren to their grandparents and go back to Adelaide. And so I went back to Adelaide and lasted about 18 months and decided that I wanted to move again career-wise. And the Alice Springs job came up. I'd actually got and won a job in private PR and didn't particularly like the thought of that. And so just before I was due to leave the ABC, I said, well, you know, the ABC, the job in Alice Springs is up again. I'd be interested in going back if you wanted to give me further promotion. So I went back to Alice Springs. It was quite funny because the first day I got there, I walked down the street and somebody said, oh, David, you've been away on holidays, have you? And I've been away for 18 months, I suppose. You know, I mean, in a place like Alice Springs, you're a moderately sized fish in a small pond. But I mean, more than anything else, I mean, Alice Springs is it's a central part of the continent. It is it's a fantastic setting, and it lies in some of our best country. I really do enjoy. I really did enjoy being in Alice Springs. I miss the McDonnell Ranges, the Desert Oaks, the Spinifex, and the Dry Creek beds. Yeah,
the spirit of the place.
There's just an ancientness of the country there. You know, just. And I do miss a lot of the people from the Northern Territory because they're sort of generally generous. They accept you for what you are, who you are, generally. And there are sort of always going to be misfits, missionaries, and mercenaries. And I mean, in the end, I suppose I probably went there as a mercenary, but probably still a misfit. Certainly wasn't a missionary. But
it also encapsulates all the social issues that are going on in Australia.
Well, a huge amount of. I mean, it still is. I think it epitomises a lot of the disparity of Australia. I mean, you have people who are in Alice Springs and who are doing extremely well. Thank you very much. And they are doing it at somebody else's expense. And I mean, I don't know whether it's seen as a good thing, but my sort of vision of dispossession, of disadvantage is an Indigenous woman living somewhere in a Central Australian outstation with crappy water, depended on perhaps an equally dysfunctional Aboriginal male for transport to health services, probably pretty crappy access to a whole range of things that white Australia or in fact urban Australia take for granted. I don't know. I mean, that's I think it. You know, it's the it's a feeling of. Well, I think there is, there are elements of great hopelessness there, which sort of despair. I despair of. As a reporter in Alice Springs, I probably didn't do enough to draw that to people's attention. I think in the 80s it was a very difficult situation, and maybe I welched on it a bit.
One of the things you mentioned was at the time Xavier got the Order of Australia.
Xavier said that he'd been approached about being given an AO, and he said, I wrote back and said, don't bother. I don't want to have a bunyip knighthood. It's some scheme that Gough Whitlam went off to visit the Queen in Buckingham Palace and dreamt up the idea of an Australian award system, and it was I call it the bunyip knighthood. I didn't want to have a part of it. So that was quite interesting. So we got a bit of traction too at the time, a bit of coverage around the place, but among certain areas. So it was. I think he said it with. It was quite with a lot of conviction, but it was also a light-hearted sort of approach to that. So yeah.
But he'd be pretty disappointed, wouldn't he, with Australia still having a queen as the head of state now?
I think definitely. I mean, he was of Irish stock, of course. I mean, Xavier Herbert, or Alfred Francis Xavier Herbert, got to be Irish, and Irish Catholic stock. So he strongly rejected, the Queen and the monarchy, and so I think he probably would. Had he sort of survived through the Republican debate, he would have been one of those cursing the outcome of the referendum in the 90s. So yeah, he would have been, I think, disgusted.
But that was set up to fail, wasn't it? So
well, I think I wasn't going to say too much there, but I have to be a good public servant. I have to serve the government of the day, but there were certainly things. Said by others with a colourful turn of phrase about breaking Australia's heart.
And it did.
And I think even the Northern Territory bid for statehood, he would have suggested had been derailed by people who were interested in maintaining the cash flow and the status quo of the great cash cow, Northern Territory.
Right. Perhaps we move on to his funeral now, because you played a central role in that. You actually, is there anything you want to say about his final days before he died?
Well, as I said, he nominated me as his next of kin, and when he went and after he came out of having had his carpal tunnel syndrome operated on, he stayed at Arlene and Hans's place, but he still had some stuff left out at Ross River, stuff that he couldn't get in on in his Land Rover and caravan when he came into town, and so he sort of was pretty keen to get back out there and bring them into town. And I think the idea was that ultimately he would go to another location and write again, through probably after the heat of the summer period. I think probably it would have been too hard for him to be out bush in the summer, and so we went out to pick up. There was a bit of stuff, a bit of camping gear. He had an exercise bike that he wanted to bring in. I think he sort of. I know that he was a keen runner in the days before he had his knees wore out and he had his knees operated on, and so I think he found that an exercise bike was a good way to stay fit. He certainly had some interesting theories about conditioning himself for the outback conditions. I mean, for example, he would strive to get along on minimum amount of water, which I think the modern sort of theory would say was probably not good for the kidneys these days. He also used to self-medicate as a pharmacist, and he was quite interested in that. He also had a friendship with Andrew Barr, who was the pharmacist at the hospital. So he used to occasionally drop into to the Alice Springs Hospital, and Andrew actually was one of the authors of the Indigenous Pharmacopoeia, which was a big production, I think, for the bicentenary of Australia. They did a thing on Indigenous treatment, and so I think he was interested in all those sorts of things. I mean, he was absolutely inquiring, had an absolutely inquiring mind. He was interested in computers, and at a time before I'd even had a computer, and had learned how to use a computer, and so I mean, he was he had, as I say, a really fertile mind which used to explore, and we would you would discuss all sorts of ideas. I mean, it's very, and you would go down in interesting burrows, and he would say, what about this and what about that, and a conversation with him was always a fascinating thing. You would never know quite where you would end. Anyway, to come back to the point of the thing, I took him on his. We went out. I had a twin cab ute at that stage of the game. We went out, to had a family trip out with my wife and my kids, and we went out and had a picnic out somewhere down in the Ndala Gorge, I think. Picked up his gear and brought it back to town, and so I set him up at we sort of unloaded at Hans and Arlene's place, and anyway, I got a phone call in the morning. He said, "Oh, great to have the exercise bike. I did a massive ride last night. It was really great, and I really burned along." And anyway, the next day I got had a phone call from Arlene. She was quite upset, quite worried, and she said, "I think he's having a heart attack. Can you come around and talk to him and see him?" And so I went round there, and Xavier was sitting upstairs in a chair, puffing and panting, and he obviously was in the midst of quite a bad heart episode. And I said, "Oh, Xavier, I think we've got to get a doctor." He said, "It's all right. My doctor will be back at midday." Xavier, I think you've got to have a doctor now. I rang a doctor friend, and I said, "Look, Xavier, I think he's having a heart attack. I think and the doctor was quite interested in, said he would drop everything and come around and help." And Xavier said, "No, I don't want him. I'll wait and see my doctor." And that was, of course, Charles Butcher, who'd been out of town, when he comes back at lunchtime. So I thought, okay, well, look, you're the patient. There's not much I can do to convince you to get timely treatment. So I went to the airport and met Charles off the plane, because at those days there were only about a couple of planes a day, and so I said, "Look, Charles, you have to come, and I think Xavier's pretty crook, wondering, are you able to go and see him?" So Charles went and saw him, and in fact they and he treated him, and he took him over to his house, and that was, I think that was probably the final few weeks that Xavier was around. Of course, Xavier passed away on a Saturday morning in November, I think, at Charles and Laurel's house in Clark Street, and I used to go around and visit, what have you. So yeah, so that was, I mean, I think, I don't know particularly about the final sort of reason, but I guess heart failure, renal failure, perhaps his treatments of himself. But I'd done a radio program on that Saturday morning, and I got a phone call at the studio from Charles saying, you should come around. Xavier won't last. And so I was there. I suppose at their place when he died, and so yeah, Charles and I wrapped him up in a sheet and put him into the back of Charles's land what was it, a troop carrier, and took his body to the mortuary. So that was sort of a final rite, and then of course we rang Robin, his factotum in Redlynch, and she'd been aware of what had been going on and had visited, and so she flew over. We announced, I think, that Xavier had passed away on the Sunday, and then started planning for a funeral. And it was a collective planning, really, between the three of us. We consulted the local funeral director, and we had, of course, a number of phone calls from people about the timing, asking for the timing so that we could delay it so they could all get together, particularly some of his Indigenous friends.
Kungarikan.
Sorry?
The Kungarikan people.
Yeah. So we did that, and we really weren't sure about how it would happen, because Xavier was pretty much he was a non-believer, I think. So we needed to have something that was, I guess, non-religious, but that also enabled some of the ceremonial aspects that the paperback people brought to it, and so I was sort of thinking. We were thinking about how it might work, and I suggested that Pat Dodson, who then was, I think, communications officer, may well have been the director of the Central Land Council, and had been a priest. Pat would be the ideal guy to do that, and so rang Pat and enlisted his assistance. And I mean, Pat, wonderful man, and did a great job. Of course, he did a great job. But
did he know Xavier? Or was that more out of friendship to you?
I think it was sort of more. I'm not certain. Potentially he may have known Xavier. I just don't recall the detail. But certainly it was. He was quite pleased to do that, and to advise, to help, and I suppose it was really to just to assist, really, to make sure that it all sort of worked, and appropriate recognition of this man was given, and we looked around, and there was certainly an Aboriginal flag on his coffin, and I looked around because, of course, him being staunch Republican, I wanted to get the Eureka flag, and I borrowed one from a guy who was a staffer in one of the electorate offices down there, and anyway, they were going to lower the casket into the grave, and I'm thinking, I've got to take this flag back because I've only borrowed it. I'm thinking, shit. The Aboriginal flag was going to go down with the ship, and I thought, I'll get another one. So he was buried underneath the two flags. Yeah. So, and I did get another one for the guy that had lent us that one. But it was a really. For me, it was quite an emotional sort of thing, looking back at it, and it was just wonderful to see the high regard that the McGuinness family had held him, and the other Indigenous people that were there from all around the country, and they were just. It was such a just was such a I think such a great tribute to the sort of assistance, the sort of support, I suppose, he'd given them, the love that they felt for him, and the love that he'd obviously given for them. Quite interesting, you know, when he went into hospital to have his carpal tunnel syndrome operation, I went and visited him the night that he'd arrived, and he was, I think, a little bit spooked because I don't think he was aware that there were any McGuinness family people in town, but I think it was one of the he'd seen one of the family. I think it might have been Speedy, because certainly Speedy was the most prominent member of the McGuinness family in Alice Springs at the time. And he'd said, you know, he'd seen him, and he was sort of, I think, a bit spooked because he was certainly, there was some suggestion that if he didn't pull through, that they wanted to make certain that he was sort of treated with the right rights, if you like, the correct rights. And so there was this sort of slightly, you know, surreal sort of metaphysical aspect to that, just sort of in the background of this this procedure that he was going to have. It was quite interesting, you know. It was quite well, interesting is probably a bit of probably not a true reflection, but you know, it was thought provoking, I guess.
So he had an appropriate funeral, basically.
Well, I think, you know, to come back to that, I think that he did. There was, there was smoking carried out. There was certainly the McGuinness family were, you know, the senior member.
Well represented.
Yeah, they were well. Yeah, they came from Cairns. They came from Darwin. There were people from Townsville, because of course Xavier had spent a lot of time in that tropical north, so yes, they were you know, well represented. I mean, I think pretty much any McGuinness who could get there got there, and as I say, we held the funeral up for a couple of days to allow them, you know, the time to travel, and so we had a great gathering around the table at Charles and Laurel's butcher's place, and then I think that night we went and had quite a few drinks with people at another place in town. So he was certainly sent off appropriately at the cemetery, and then I guess there were appropriate sort of collective ceremonies around town, and certainly it was just
And
Mm.
yet Xavier's work's been largely forgotten now.
I think it's a bit. I think it's very sad. I think that I don't know whether it's on the curriculum even for the study of Australian literature at the universities these days. I think it's a bit sad. I think we've moved on to sort of more of a pop culture. I mean, I suppose we now tweet and Facebook and YouTube a lot, and people don't sort of. I mean, I guess if you were to say, it's a funny sort of a funny sort of comparison, but we don't. Not so many people now take the time to smell the roses, and by smelling the roses, I mean just sit down and read a book of the magnitude of Poor Fellow My Country, or even of Capricornia, and we sort of forget. We are forgetting some of those sorts of times, which have given birth to our nation as it is now.
Any final comments or anecdotes that you want to say that we haven't covered at all, David?
I've never sort of, as I've said, as a journalist, I probably neglected my craft when I didn't interview Xavier, and it's probably one of those things that I regret. You always expect people like that to be cast iron, to go on forever, you know. And I mean, it was a bit. That sort of the final few weeks were really, I guess, took me by surprise. You know, I expected that he'd be around for a little longer. I think that, certainly, I mean, I think that Xavier was Xavier was a very complex man. I think he certainly had a great love of his life, but I think he also was a bit of a philanderer. I think he enjoyed the company of women particularly, and enjoyed women, and I think I know that he talked to me a lot about when Sadie died and the heartbreak that was, because I think he realised that he had lost his one true lover, or one true love and lover, and he wanted to do the right thing for her as a Jew, and he talks about her funeral, and basically he arranged a proper Jewish casket for her, but then he got to the crematorium, it was just him and her. And he said to the funeral director, I think, said to him, "Now, you want me here?" He said, "No, just tell me, you know, what to do to lower the casket down," because it was a cremation. And I think that was sort of something that I think the Jewish faith doesn't or didn't tolerate at that stage of the game. But he thought, well, you know, I've got to do this, and I don't just. Thought of her mouldering in the ground was sort of anathema to him, so he took her to a crematorium, and he told me he sort of spoke to her and said, you know, this is it, and you know, probably a bit of confessional perhaps, and then pressed the button and the casket lowered away, and I think he. This is the story I think is as best I remember, and he waited around and picked up her, and he got her ashes, and he travelled with her ashes, and they were always with him, and in fact we ensured that they were put into the casket with him. I think he also spoke to me about his passing, and his ideal would have been to have, he said, when the time comes, I want you to take me out and leave me under a tree. And of course I never fulfilled that.
Thanks very much, Dave.
So I probably let him down. Yeah. But I suppose that, you know, in the circumstances, it was probably not possible. I think, you know, I figured there was, as I said, plenty of time for that to happen. You know, I said, I don't know that. You know, I just want to sort of see you disappear into the desert and not know what became of you. He said, well, I don't particularly want any great mausoleum or memorial to me. I don't want people to come and... So we did the next best thing, was to plant him in the Alice Springs Garden Cemetery, and I don't know whether pilgrims go to his grave or not. I've only ever visited it once, which is probably a bit neglectful of me. But, I mean, under the Christian sort of, I don't claim to be a Christian, but the Christian thing is that the mortal remains are not you anyway, so never, I mean, I still have my image of Xavier and my sort of, you know, consciousness of Xavier that I carry.
My name's Dave Richards. I'm a journalist and a broadcaster. I've lived in Alice Springs on and off since about 1978, and I met Xavier Herbert pretty much at this spot in about 1984. Actually, I saw him in the library and recognised him pretty well straight away, but of course I thought, Xavier Herbert, what's he doing in Alice Springs? He's a top end guy, you know, and but I was curious and I said, are you Xavier Herbert? And he said, well, what is it to you, or who are you, some words to that effect. But from there we developed, you know, a friendship of sorts, and of course I was interested in him from a journalistic point of view, and we did eventually did quite a long interview, which was I believe the last long interview that Xavier did, and it wasn't long after that, a few months after that, that he died. So I didn't know a huge amount about Xavier Herbert. I think Capricornia for me was my introduction to the history of the territory. I read it when I first came here, and it gave me a very exciting and illuminating picture of what life had been like in the territory and how it came to be the place that it was. But as I said, it was very much focused on the top end, and of course here he was in Central Australia, and I was curious about what he was doing down here. And it soon became apparent that that Xavier was on a spiritual journey. He talked about Central Australia as being the great mystery, and I think he wanted to return in some way to the centre, or not return, but to go to the centre of the country, and that's where he wanted to die, which is exactly what happened. And a lot of what we talked about was in relation to Central Australia, what he thought about Central Australia, and he said some very memorable things which have stuck in my mind. He described Central Australia as the stage on which the great themes of Australian life are played out. And that phrase has really stuck with me the whole time that I've worked in Central Australia. I didn't quite understand what he meant, but the more that I've worked here and the stories that I've seen unfold here, they have a almost archetypal reality, and the things that happen here are not just events, they have a symbolic kind of importance. You know, the Azaria Chamberlain story, for example, the American alliance as it exists at Pine Gap, and the land rights story, the whole struggle between, I suppose, the historical struggle for Aboriginal people to establish their situation within the country and their relationship with white people, and vice versa. You know, this is happening here in front of our eyes, and Xavier saw that, and I was privileged to be here and see it myself too.
So can you remember any other themes that he was particularly focused on during that time?
He talked a lot about his relationship with his wife. Mm-hmm. He also talked about his intention to write a book about Central Australia. Well, naturally, we talked about his whole life, his time in the top end, you know, in Western Australia, a lot of things, really, his philosophies on life. But he also talked a lot about Central Australia, what he was doing here. And one of the things was that he intended to write his last novel here. It was going to be called Billy Goat Hill. Now, Billy Goat Hill is a pretty well-known landmark around town. It's in the centre of town. I'm not sure what happened at Billy Goat Hill, although we may have discussed it. I can't remember. Certainly we didn't discuss it on the record. But the book was going to be about, of course, relationships on the frontier. He was interested in getting different perspectives on the frontier. He talked about wanting to meet pastoralists to find out what they thought, because the relationship between Aboriginal people in Central Australia and the pastoralists, the cattle people, was a very complex one, beginning with conflict and then, of course, ending in a kind of arrangement in which you had Aboriginal people working on pastoral stations for many years, and then later that all collapsing. And he was also interested in the contemporary events of Central Australia, the racism, the tension that was developing between, people in the town. I think that was going to be part of his subject matter as well.
And what do you think he'd think about some of the issues that are around town at the moment in Alice Springs?
Yeah.
Perhaps you should explain some of those.
Okay, I think Herbert's perspective on the relationship between white and black Australia was unusual, and in some ways it's become unfashionable. He talked about his vision of a Creole nation. I think, apart from the fact that he thought that individual Aboriginal groups should be struggling for their rights, he also had a very strong vision of a more united Australia in which Aboriginal and white people would mix together and create this Creole nation. I think he'd be disappointed at the level of I guess tension that still exists here, possibly at the standoff that still often exists between Aboriginal people and white people. But he would also have an awareness that at another level people are getting together, that there is a lot of genuine communication and goodwill between white people and black people in this town, and that it's a process. It's an historical process that's going to take a while to sort out. And I reckon Xavier could have made a great contribution to that with his wisdom and his insight and his understanding of the historical forces involved.
Is there anything else you'd like to say, Dave, about your time? Anything at all, anecdotal or otherwise, that of your brief time with Xavier, that a significant time in his life?
Well, apart from the fact that he was who he was, he was also a very likeable, gentle person, and that's what impressed me most about him. He was humble in a way, approachable, friendly. I used to wear a mohair jumper around. It was winter time when Xavier was here mostly, and whenever we'd run into each other, he was fascinated with this mohair jumper, and he'd stroke it whenever we'd talk. So he took a certain delight in just the ordinary details of life. He was very much alive. Despite his age, he was aware of what was going on around him, not just the politics, but nature, people, and he engaged a lot of people. A lot of people felt very close to him in the short time that he lived in Alice Springs.
I'm Charles William Butcher. I'm a retired surgeon. I came to Alice Springs in the beginning of 1980 and practiced there until a little over 12 months ago. in 1984, probably in the middle of the year, I met up with Xavier Herbert when he was visiting a neighbour in Alice Springs. And a few weeks later, Xavier sought me out to do some minor surgery to his wrists. He stated that he did his homework and wanted me to do the surgery.
And Laurel, how did you first meet Xavier?
I'm assuming I met him before he actually came to stay with us. I remember visiting him when he was staying at somebody else's place.
He came to the house for the consultation, I think.
Oh,
That's right.
He came to the neighbours and then came over to our house, which was through a back gate, to discuss meeting up with him whether I would agree to be his surgeon.
And I'm sorry, I should have let you introduce yourself, Laurel. Perhaps you should do that now. Yeah.
I'm Laurel Butcher, and I've been Charles's wife for 45 years. We've
And
walked a few paths.
You're also a nurse?
I was a nurse many years ago.
Were you a nurse at the time?
No.
Right. Okay. And perhaps now you can talk about Xavier's, your involvement with Xavier. Herbert.
My initial involvement with Xavier was as a surgeon. He had a problem with his wrists and he asked me whether I would carry out treatment, and I did this in 2 episodes over several weeks. It was following his second operation. He was unwell following the surgery, and I had him in hospital for several days. During this time, he requested that I spend time with him, and he told me quite a lot about himself and his ideas and what he was doing in Alice Springs.
And he also, you suggested that he actually had done his homework on you.
He said he had done his homework on me and chose me to do the surgery. And he actually spent quite a bit of his time trying to befriending me.
And he also insisted on you being his doctor, didn't he? Is that something?
He insisted, well, after he was out of hospital the second time, he became very unwell while I was away in Adelaide, and I endeavoured to get a physician colleague to go and see him, but he refused to see anyone, and when I returned I found him very unwell and insisted that he wouldn't go to hospital, and if I didn't treat him he wouldn't be treated at all. So I agreed to treat him if he agreed to come and stay with us so that I could manage his medical condition and Laurel could nurse him.
That's a very unusual thing for a doctor to do, to invite a patient back to their home. Was there something about Xavier or did you feel like you had no choice, or what?
I had strong feelings for the man because he had shared quite a lot with me over the time, and when he said that he wouldn't have treatment unless I gave it to him, I felt that was the only course available. Laurel was used to me bringing people home for meals, and interesting people would often be coming to our place, and sometimes at short notice.
We've had a few people from overseas or that spent a few days with us who have been stranded somewhere.
Right. So even though you're quite a reserved man, you're actually there's a deep passion in you, and you must have connected with Xavier at some level.
Yes, I've felt that. He said that the bond between us was remarkable, with a big smile on his face, and also made a point of, he had 2 noted visitors. I can't remember the second one. Sidney Nolan came through the hospital, and he made up with him during that time and insisted that I come there and meet Sidney Nolan and also be there present while they talked to one another.
Right. And what was it like having Xavier actually living with you? in their house?
It's hard to put in just a few words. He showed obvious enjoyment of sharing in the family meal and stating that he really hadn't had family around him at mealtime, and one got the idea that he regretted not having this experience.
He actually said that he was sorry that he hadn't had children at that particular stage.
I wrote the eulogy for Xavier for his funeral.
I remember Xavier telling us how he took his script for Poor Fellow My Country to the publisher in a wheelbarrow because there was so many pages. It was so big, and I remember him saying, with regard to Sadie dying, that he said, "I'm free, but for what?" And I quite often think of that in those intervening 26 years. I'm free, but for what?
I was quite moved by his steadfastness in his appeal to, not appeal, in his care or, yes, almost pastoral care for the Aborigines that he knew and lived and worked with.